So, Shawn, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast and to have a discussion around ultimately fear and ego as we're creating and looking to create social change. So I appreciate you're the person for this because you and I have had several sort of conversation off the grid to talk about egos that we see, egos that are getting in the way of true change. So thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm just going to quickly give your bio. You have a very long bio because you've accomplished a lot of things.
Well, I'm very old also.
No, you're very young and you've done so much. But I'm just going to list a few things that sort of help folks understand who you are. So Shawn Newell is a retired vice president of business development at Industrial Supply Company, where you worked for 37 years.
Yeah, long time.
That's a long time. It's a big commitment to stay close in sight of a company.
It's not the norm now.
It's not the norm.
No.
You serve as a community integrator, which I love that word because that is you. Mm-hmm. The community integrator, serving on so many boards. I don't know how you do it. You are, I would say it's more than 5 boards across Utah and nationally. You serve on the Utah 3rd District Court Committee for Self-Represented Parties. You're currently a trustee at Westminster University, a member of the 3rd District Court Office of Accountability Committee, the Advisory Committee for Unite, Vice President for the NAACP, the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights Utah Advisory Committee. And that's just like, I'm just scratching the surface. You saw, I copied and pasted a big one, and then I did this just for time, and I wanted to
very
get
good
into it.
because there's too much.
It's a lot of big accomplishments. And I think aside from your bio and what's written about you, I know you personally, and I have always known you to be a community connector, an integrator, someone that stays strong in community, that keeps community at the heart of what you do. And also, I've seen you in action in conflict resolution in community, especially as you're trying to make change. And so some of the rooms that you are in, rooms with political leaders, rooms with business owners, community leaders, what is the common thing that comes up when it pertains to fear? What are people afraid of when we get into conversations where people just see differently from each other?
Well, I can speak from my perspective. One of the things when I get into these spaces is people are fearful of really speaking their truths because they're afraid of offending me in the room because of who I am and what I have done. So it's becoming a pretty big barrier for me now. When I step into a room, I can see that the environment starts to shift, and that I'm starting to see people be a little more apprehensive to say the things that they would say if I was not in the space. And that is a tough thing to navigate now. And I'm trying to work on finding ways to put people at ease so they're not as uncomfortable. But the fear also comes from their attempts to be performative. When I step into a space, and others that step into a space that work where I do in trying to make sure our communities are bridged. And that is a real tough thing a real tough hurdle to overcome right now, because if they are holding back on ideas or mindsets that might be in conflict with what the rest of the group is doing, we can't move forward. Conflict is okay. Conflict is fine as long as we're dignified in the way that we do it, and we're not creating havoc in misunderstanding or being afraid of people. And you cannot be defensive either. in those spaces. And a lot of times fear brings upon defensiveness, and that defensiveness can be in silence. It can be in stepping back in the room and not participating. So one of the things that I try to do is, if I can visually see that happening with people, trying to pull them in and make them feel comfortable, even before the conversation starts a lot of times. But it's still hard because it's nature for us to be afraid. It's nature for us to be cautious, but it's also natural for us to be courageous and to release our ego when we find the right environment that we can do that in. But it has to be a safe environment. And I think creating these safe environments for people, both literally and figuratively, is critical to removing fear and ego out of all the conversations that we have.
Yeah. So what are people afraid of? What are you noticing that people are afraid of?
They're afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Okay.
They're afraid of, a lot of times, and it's sad, people are afraid of standing behind their own convictions. And they're afraid of being ostracized or excoriated for saying something that they truly believe, which for me, I'd rather have you throw everything out on the table so we know where we're coming from in the relationship that we're trying to build in conversation.
Yeah. And so when you think about, the recent legislation that's come out, all the different conversations that are happening socially, people making decisions for things that they don't entirely know. You're in those conversations. You're talking to legislators. You're talking to powerful people. And I admire the work that you do because you're face to face with folks and you're trying to understand the humanity and where their reasoning is for a certain bill to come up that may take the dignity of a whole community, that may impede on equity. You come face to face with them.
Yes.
What do those conversations look like now? What have they been looking like for you?
The conversations have been more difficult to take place.
Yeah.
Because let me back up a little bit. A lot of and I love our legislators. I love our, Senate. I love our governor. But when you're misinformed, you should not implement policy. And that's what we ran into. Misinformation, not understanding, not doing homework, not understanding the full impact of the decisions that were being made is a fault. And that was a result of fear, the fear of pushing against the status quo within that circle of influence, the fear of being ostracized by your constituents. That is critical. And that type of fear is very destructive because if you are not well educated on the topics and issues that you are actually legislating, then you have no business legislating that topic or that issue. You should be willing to be courageous enough to take a step back and say, I can't push this because I don't understand it. I'm not going to go based on what an intern tells me or what snippets that I'm reading in the paper or things that people are feeding me that are negative, that I know are negative because they wouldn't be feeding it to me the way that they're feeding it to me. And taking that and actually creating legislation on it, I'd say shame on folks for doing that. And that's a lack of courage. That's a lack of resiliency to stand strong within your own self.
So how does one find that courage and resiliency, and what's holding them back from tapping into this? So we're talking about leaders that are making final decisions.
Yeah.
And they're being influenced to make the final decision because they don't have full scope of what actually is needed. They don't they're not fully educated about a certain topic or issue. What is it that's keeping them from tapping into resiliency and courage to step up and say, I don't know enough, I'm not going to pass this?
It is that fear, because what happens is if you go and educate yourself, now you become accountable. And if you do the research, if you actually go out and integrate into the communities that you're, impacting by the decisions that you're making, now you're accountable. But if you can stay outside on that peripheral and not step in there, When do you have to be accountable? You can say or do almost anything you want and still feel okay about yourself. But if you have delved into the real issues and gained an understanding of where people are and communities are, then that accountability will weigh heavy on you. And that accountability, especially for me being a black man, is constant. Growing up, I had to deal with things that a lot of our legislators haven't had to deal with. I've had to deal with environments that were almost unthinkable, but I had to overcome those through having courage and resiliency. They haven't had to do that. But it's strange that I have to live in their world and I can still find courage and resiliency and strength. And I still have fears. I still have apprehensions, but I don't let that hamper my decisions. I make sure that I'm making the decision that I can be accountable for as an individual that will also impact positively my community.
Yeah. So when you're sitting down, because you and I, we've had a lot of conversations.
I've been dancing around that. I don't know where you're headed.
Well, no, I just you and I have had a lot of conversations, and you're because you're so. You keep community at the forefront. Mm-hmm. You were willing to sit one-on-one with folks, face to face, and have a full conversation and understanding. Not to say you don't have enough courage, you don't have enough resiliency, but just to understand what the reasoning is behind this. Have you seen people change just with the one-on-one conversations that you've had? Have you seen changes in them and sort of owning, parts of decisions that are made?
That's I'm glad you asked that question, because I work with people. I do some coaching, private coaching and stuff, and life coaching types of things. And I'm very good at reading people when I have conversations with them. And I have seen people actually the switch flip a little bit and the dial turn when I've had conversations. And sometimes I go in with information that they don't know that I have, that I know that will actually touch them. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about touching people. We're talking about getting to their hearts, for them to understand that we're all in this as humans, and to look at things from a humanistic viewpoint. And I watch body language. But to have people verbalize things is very interesting. In a group, this is natural, psychologists will tell you. In a group, everybody's just like, yeah, okay, I heard it. Like, very good. Thank you very much. But after conversations, when I've had public speaking events or I've made presentations, individuals come up to me and one-on-one they say, thank you very much. I had no idea. Thank you very much for illuminating this to me. I'd like to have you share this with another group that I'm involved with. And those little wins to me are priceless, because I know that I've reached them. I know that they've heard it, but now I'd like to build on their capacity to go out and expand that. It's that rule of 10. I'd love for them to be able to go out and tell 10 more people what they've heard and what they've learned, and to be strong enough to do that.
Yeah.
But I do see it in people when we're talking. When I talk to politicians, of course, I watch them squirm first when they squirm in the seat. And then I watch their pauses as they try to determine how or what they're going to say next.
How do you, what does that look like? So I'm curious, just walk us through sitting in a room with a politician who maybe their track record is not as aligned with access, equity, social justice. Mm-hmm. Walk us through what that conversation, because you're such a social justice advocate. You're such a, like I said, community-driven change advocate. Mm-hmm. And so walk us through that.
One of the things that we always have to be willing to do, and especially in my position, is to make people get just a little uncomfortable. Not so uncomfortable that they become defensive, but just a little bit uncomfortable to know that they're in a real conversation. And for a lot of times, for people that are in power, my approach is a little off-putting, because I talk to them just like we've been talking now. Mm-hmm. And they're not used to that. They're used to somebody coming with an agenda. They're used to somebody coming with their battle shield out and ready to fight. And when I can ease that tension through, just general conversation and being honest with them and upfront, I start to pull things out of them. And I ask the hard questions, but not in a way that's going to pressure them to feel like, oh no, this guy's going to come after me. I allow them those opportunities to circumvent the conversation. People will pick up something and go, oh, did you know that I had this? And I'll do that to them too. I learned that in sales. You pick something that's on their desk or something, and you know how that goes.
Yeah.
And you start a conversation about it. But then I loop it right back around to, hey, well, since you're doing this, can we have a conversation about this other issue, another topic? Now, some people get really defensive, and when you see people start to cross their arms and sit back and, get to that point where their chin is tucked in their chest and they're not ready to talk, sometimes you have to ask them, are you okay with the conversation that we're having? And if they say yes and stay in the same position, they're not being upfront with me. If they say, yeah, I'm okay with it, you start to see them relax their limbs and, start to maybe shake your leg a little bit. That's okay. But they start to open up and talk. But people at the highest levels, from our governors to even the president. I had a chance to talk briefly with President Biden before, and just having him tell me in a 30-second conversation a part of his life that I had no idea about. I asked him, I said, so, he was here in Utah talking about his book, about his son and part of his life. And I said, so what else do you do that helps you engage with the community? And he goes, well, something that you might not know is I'm a lifetime member of the NAACP. And I thought, really? President Biden, okay. I said, well, I wish we could talk longer because they're scooting you along. You can't really stay there. Yeah. But in that little bit of time, I was able to pull that information out of him. I had a conversation with Governor Herbert when he was current governor, and he was vetting me for a position with the state. And he and I had a one-on-one. And he kept trying to move to the sports stuff, and talk about sports. But I kept having to remind him. I said, I love sports. I played sports, all the way through college and the pros. I said, but the conversation we're here about is education. And I said, right now, we need to talk about that. And then we can talk about sports for the rest of the time we have together. And he was like, oh, okay. And we got right back on topic. But sometimes you have to guide people. And watching them sometimes, they get very defensive. Some people never come back. They never come back to the conversation. You can see them being standoffish, and you try to push a little bit. You don't want to push too much because you never want to be alienated and not allowed back into the room again. So in those cases, I just back off. And I say, I'll get with you another day and we'll continue this conversation. But I also follow up on that other day, and I'll continually call them and I'll email them and I'll say, hey, we need to set up another date. Don't try to avoid me because we're going to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. And if I don't have that conversation with you, this is not a threat, but I'll have it with others around you. And you might not be privy to what's spoken in those meetings.
Oh, so that gets them. You're going to be left out. You're going to be irrelevant.
Exactly. Work on a little psychology here. Because guess what? No matter how old and smart and successful we are as human beings, we never get out of the sandbox. We are never out of that place where we want to be a part of something and we don't want to be left out. So even in these conversations when they're tough, people want to be a part of it. Now, to what degree, that's to be determined through the conversations, but they do want to be a part of it. Those that don't will be adamant about it, and I don't want anything to do with this. But eventually, they're going to want to know because they're going to get asked questions when they get out in the real world, away from you and in the conversation, and they won't have an answer. And that's when I really like it, because then they call me back and say, hey, can we spend a little time together? How about a little training? How about an opportunity for you to speak to my team? Those type of things come back. But it's engaging people where they are, not trying to create any fear, because the fear is already there, but helping them navigate that space more than me navigating it for them.
Yeah. I imagine this work that you do, because as I'm walking through it, as I'm imagining, as I'm thinking about you in that space, it takes quite a bit from you, right?
It's tough.
And so how do you navigate yourself? Because there's I know what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
I have the strategies. I understand this is a human. Like, you've got all the elements in place, but then there's you as an individual who's also lived a lot of your life here in Utah and also have been impacted directly, and also your family and your community. So there's you in this.
Yeah.
Where are you in this?
That's always a hard one for me because in this work we tend to forget ourselves. And I forget myself an awful lot. And all the service that I do, I have to just stop sometimes and say, why am I doing these things? Remind myself of that why. And it gets hard a lot of times. It's burdensome because you want to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to be divisive. You're not going to do something that's going to harm your community that you're trying to serve. And you also don't want to harm yourself. You don't want to put yourself into a corner where you just can't get out of. And that's a hard thing to do. And it weighs me down sometimes. Sometimes I have to just go and lay my head on the pillow and stare at the ceiling for a little while. And first, I give thanks that I am able to do these things. Second, I have to say, forgive myself for doing some of these things. And then third, I have to thank myself for being willing to do the work.
Yeah.
And if I can remind myself of those things, I can stay energized. But it's difficult work. There's sometimes, there's 2 losses to every win. And that's the hardest part. You can negotiate and work with, especially like with the legislature, for a year, and you can have people say, "Oh, it's going to be okay. This is where I'm going. I'm not quite sure which way I'm going to vote." And then you get time for the legislation to be enacted, and they follow suit. The sheep begin to follow, and it's disappointing. And you have to go back and then instead of laying your head on your pillow, you stuff your face in the pillow and scream. But you just have to have that release sometime. Yeah. But for me, I find ways to relax now. I'm working on that through a lot of the reading I'm doing to educate myself, and then also taking time to get out and go fishing, and most of the time just sit by the water or sit on a boat and just have quiet and try not to think about all the stuff that's going on that's burdening me, and then come back, a little more energized and feeling a little stronger to be able to keep the fight alive.
Yeah. You seem, because I've seen you in these rooms, and you seem very unfazed, not unfazed in that you are not passionate in the issues that we talk about, unfazed to the point where it doesn't internalize as you, or it's not an indictment on you. How did you get there? Because when I do this work and I see my colleagues doing this work, there's a lot of internalization. There's a lot of, because we're carrying responsibility, especially when we're one of the only ones in the room.
Yeah.
We're carrying quite a bit of responsibility, and when we fail, or when it doesn't go the way that is a win, it's internalized, and BIPOC communities that are doing this work internalize this work so much so that it becomes them.
Yeah.
How I don't see that. And I'm not you, so I wouldn't know. But it seems as though it doesn't faze you that way.
Well,
have you always been that way? And how did you get to a point where it didn't faze you? Or
well, the secret is I'm part duck. You see, a duck is calm on the surface, but underneath there's a whole lot going on.
Yeah.
And I do internalize a lot of the things, but I've learned through my history that I can overcome an awful lot. I was part of the desegregation of a school system growing up, and I've told you that story a little bit before.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was in 1965. The Riverside City School District determined that they were going to desegregate their schools prior to receiving a court order from the U.S. government. And in 1968, I was the third class to be bused to an all-white school from our neighborhood. There were 2 busloads of us that went to an all-white elementary school. And literally, we crossed the Victoria Bridge. So there's a bridge that we crossed, and the neighborhoods were stark different from one side of the bridge, one end of the bridge to the other. And as a youngster, you don't pay attention to, why. I had no idea why I couldn't go to school where all the people that were in my neighborhood were going to school, or I should say the street and block behind me. But as I got older, and I remember the conversations that community leaders and my family had when they met at our home to talk about the need for a better education for their students. And I didn't even realize that I was one of the students they were talking about. I'm like, what are they talking about? But the gentleman that actually led that effort was my next door neighbor, Robert Bland. And he was actually the first African-American to graduate from West Virginia, from Virginia's University of Virginia. Yeah, the University of Virginia. He's still around. He's 80 years old. I call him every now and then and just thank him for all the work and everything that he's done. But being a young person with my ear to the ground, listening to the parents in the closed door room around the table talking about ways to resolve the issues in our community, started coming back to me as I got older. And then when I started being able to see things and to see what was happening, as far as incidents of racism, incidents of segregation that were still very, obvious in the community I was growing up in, and hearing stories throughout my young life allowed me to start building some competencies there that I still, when I came to college, I didn't realize that. When I came to college, I was like, good, I'm away from my family, I'm having a great time, I'm playing football. I was the oldest of 6 kids, so I couldn't wait to get out the house. But wow. I carried a lot of that with me, and as I started to go through my college education and taking more courses like African American studies and things like that, that just started to bubble more things from the past up inside of me, and it just got me passionate. And I didn't talk to anybody about it when I was in school. I was afraid that some of my peers would be like, oh, you're just militant, or you're just this and that. And I was like, no, there's a different way to approach these things. And that's what I'm trying to do, is make sure that I approach the divisiveness that we have here in our country in a way that is receptive to a majority of people. Not everybody, but to a majority of people. And I kept that silence for a long time until I was about to graduate, and I started working for one of our Congress people. Congressman Owens. I was a voting district chairman for him for a while, and I started thinking to myself, well, how in the world would this guy let me, super soul brother from Riverside, help him and make phone calls, to this community, having nobody that looked like me in my community. I lived in Sugar House at the time. And in the early 80s, the African American population was really, really low here. But I found him to be very receptive. I found his team to be very receptive, and I found the people that I talked to be receptive to receiving my calls or me knocking on the door or whatever, to contact him. And it just kind of shook me up a little bit and said, you know what, I can keep doing this, but I can also come out of that silence and actually start speaking to people that I may have been intimidated to talk to as a young person. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to practice something, if I'm going to preach something, I better practice it. So I said, I'm just going to talk to whoever I can get a hold of and whoever will listen to me. So I got into the habit of making phone calls. I got into the habits of walking up to people and introducing myself and finding that level of comfort to where I said, there's only one thing that they could do to me that could stop me, and that's to punch me in the nose, and that's not going to happen. So I knew dang well that I could do this without harm coming to myself, other than maybe emotional harm or some other things that might bother me internally. But I just stepped up. I just said, you know what, I can do this. And I also felt the push coming from those that did it in the past, the community leaders that I grew up with, my parents, others, I could feel their hands in my back saying, go forward, keep doing what you're doing. And haven't been able to stop. I've been able to find some great mentors to help me along the way, and some of them as well. And it's a constant journey. And I'm still developing, still learning, still figuring out how to get to some people that won't let me do a podcast with them. So, I'm still working on some things, but, and even with myself, I've got to find that courage inside myself sometimes to show up at places I really don't want to, where I know that I'm not comfortable. But then again, I have the choice to say I don't want to be there. You and I worked on one that I told you the reasons I had to step away. Yeah. I just couldn't do it. I tried every which way to justify it, and I just couldn't do it. And it's very rare for me to do that. And those outside of you and me and maybe two others don't know that. Yeah. And that the leader of that entity doesn't know it to this day, and I don't care.
Yeah. So neither do I. Well, and I think that's interesting because you started this conversation talking about courage and resiliency, and when you were talking about yourself growing up and then being here in Utah, and then having the courage to speak up. Mm-hmm. And recognizing that your voice actually carries quite a bit of weight and power, and that you found it sort of your purpose to make sure that you use your voice, whether it be in conversation or it be on a stage or it be in these political realms. It's that courage that really has stuck with you as a theme.
Yeah.
And I see you talking about that to others. You need courage. Just step into it, into yourself. Mm-hmm. Trust in yourself rather than hear the noise around you. Yeah. And so that really holds true to the way you've moved, the way I've seen you move. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big lesson, even as I'm thinking about myself and folks that are in this, is to really trust in yourself. And that's where the courage, to trust your instinctive self. And so I feel like that's a beautiful lesson that you were able to learn about yourself and also share with me.
Thank you. We all are able to do that, and that's what I mean by that push you get from your relatives and mm-hmm. people that have led before. Their hands will actually go through your back inside, touch your heart, and that's where you start to find that motivation to be courageous, to be resilient, to step into these spaces, and There's nothing like it. It's like a pool. When you first jump in, it's freezing cold most of the time, and then you warm right up to it. Yeah. But there's no harm done. And, if you think about, simplifying things before, even the scary situations, I try to sympathize or simplify to the best of my ability. And I just step into it. And I just think, what's the worst that could come out of this? Somebody, not shaking my hand or somebody just walking away. Oh, so be it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we're going to have this conversation, and we're going to be upfront with each other, and you ask for it. So,
so here I am.
This is what we get.
So on the flip side of this is those who are also advocating for social justice like you are, for social change. They may not be in sort of the political realm, but they may be in corporations, they may be consultants, they may be educators, creatives, and you work with them too, mm-hmm. Yes. Right? On the flip side. Yeah. And that's a little bit easier because we're all on the same mm-hmm. space. But are we? Because what have you seen? Yeah, I'm curious what your experience is on those who are doing this work and we're not actually doing it together.
Yeah, and that's one of the tough things about this work is it's so fragmented. There's a lot of people doing a lot of great things, but we haven't come together and put a structure together. I always said one day we're going to have a corporation that this is what we do, and it's going to be one of the most powerful corporations and diversified corporations that actually starts to create these environments of understanding and for all of our communities. But again, you talked about ego before. Mm-hmm. Ego steps in and disrupts that. You bring in a number of professionals that all know the same stuff. That's great. That's a great starting point. But what you have to be willing to do is to blow all that up and discover new things as practitioners, and to be willing to do that, and to be willing to listen to something that may be counter to what you may believe in, and then try to find a way to understand that. There's such a power in what practitioners do, but we are so divided. One of the things that is critical, and we're starting to see some of that now, and you're well aware of this, is networking with practitioners. But we're having these presentations to practitioners. That's not what we need. We need to have conversations with one another. We need to dive into conversations like this to have a greater understanding of pathways, and be able to share those barriers when we run into them, and not be afraid to ask for help, not be afraid to ask for guidance, because it's a rocky journey. And if you can get some of those boulders smoothed out to where they're pebbles, you're great. And if you can get them just honed down to sand, you're wonderful. So we have to make sure that we're helping each other along on this journey, and doing that in a way that's conducive to everyone being successful, not getting to where ego is leading the actions that are taking place. And we're seeing more and more of that. Practitioners have to continue learning. We've got to continue learning, and we've got to continue to step into some of those spaces we don't want to step into. When you know you're jumping into the pot and the water's boiling, sometimes you still got to take that dive. And you'll learn when you're in it. You can say yay or nay. I'm in it, or I'm done with this. But you'll learn from it. But you can't be afraid to take that first leap. And it's hard for some to get out of the safe speak, so to speak, and to step into the realm of saying, I'm going to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and sometimes that's scary. But I find that if you are open with people and honest with them, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be receptive. They may not want to receive everything the way you want them to receive it, but they're going to be receptive, and they're going to learn. People are going to learn. So we can't be afraid to be the professionals that we want to be. And it's hard when you work for a corporation, though. You can't do that. No. When you can go be on your own, you can do just anything you want. And if they get mad at you, they just fire you. But if you work for a corporation, it's much more difficult. But if you have a network set up that helps you understand how to navigate that a little better, now you can start to do things, become more powerful, and bring that back to your fellow practitioners as well, to talk about the results that you received and how well that worked out for you. Now you're empowering others to say, okay, I can do that as well. And maybe I'll follow that same path or do the same things that you've done.
Yeah, it's interesting, because it's not to say that practitioners and social change advocates and social justice advocates are not in this other space with politics and educators and all that, where the system is actually putting out laws and putting out all these things that are dictating communities. They're kind of integrated. But as I was talking to you, I was thinking about this idea of ego. And so you're in spaces with white men in their political power, able to make big decisions on lives of people, and their egos are in the way. And similarly, you have folks that are trying to break those barriers, and their egos are in their way. And sometimes it happens around the same. One flares up, the other flares up, and it's kind of just feeding each other. Have you seen right now in our political climate today, have you seen that? Has it flared up? Has it flared down? Are there what have you seen? What's happening?
There's a standstill right now.
Okay.
There's a standstill where people in the community and everyone, they're gathering up their arms, and folks in power and politics are gathering up their arms. They're seeing right now some of the disparate outcomes from past legislation, but one side is gathering up their arms to bring in more legislation that's going to impact the communities negatively, and then the other side is gathering up their armory to make sure they can try to defend that. Now, I'll put pressure on all your listeners. What we need to do is get those practitioners and those folks that are fighting for the community to run for those positions that those other folks are in. And if we can get more people to be courageous enough to run for public office and not be worried about all these things that probably won't ever pop up, and just step in and do it, we can make change happen. But until we get people to really step up to that level, the work is great that people are doing. It's wonderful. But you got to get to where the policies are made. And that's something that people have to do. I've experimented with it, and I won. But it was scary, but not that scary. But now I've got others saying, well, do more. And I'm going, okay, well, let me contemplate doing more. Because like I said, if I'm going to preach it, I better practice it. But we've got to get others. We got people that are young like yourself that have the ability to be able to go and have a significant impact on what goes on in our state by running for office. Now, that creates a whole big old giant fear factor for folks, and their egos are disrupted because they're like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to have this job forever, even though, I have to run for office every 2 years. We have to disrupt that. We've got to get people there. So I don't know how to motivate folks to do that, but change can really happen if we start to integrate into different spaces. And that is a space that we have to integrate in a it's almost at the emergency level right now. And we're starting to see a few folks run for office, which hopefully will make a change, but we need a whole lot of people to run for office in their communities. And that's where real community change can take place.
So you're saying we're at a sort of emergency level nationally, locally. We have a big election coming up.
Yep.
All of this is happening. What are you afraid of? Or are you afraid of anything? Do you see any fear?
I'm not as afraid as I was afraid about 4 weeks ago. But I'm afraid that we forgot about each other, first of all. That's my number one thing, that we're all in this together, and we need to be concerned about our fellow brothers and sisters. I'm afraid that our country has not learned. We're a young country. We have not learned from the mistakes that older countries have made and are continuing to make, and we've not tried to get better as a nation. I'm afraid that our young people are not being educated. They're being processed, so that we don't have the ability to educate those that are coming up in our country to be able to know first of all, the true history of our country, to know the civics of our country, how civics works, and to also have a pride in themselves as individuals, and to not be hampered by these pressures they get from technology and everything else, thinking that they have to be like the Joneses, and finding a way to build inner strength into our young people. When we take away books, when we take away curriculum, we're not empowering. We're taking power away from our young people, which in turn comes back to haunt us in our society through time. It's the miseducation of America, and we have to do something about that to build. So if we can get to the point to where we can actually share knowledge openly, and we have to do that as adults as well, we're going to be able to move forward. I got a little off track, but I do that because I get fired up.
So my last question to you, and just sort of like in this, there's fear rising up. There's people's egos getting in the way. I love your advice of saying, young folks and just folks in this side that are trying to make change to really infiltrate the space of where things actually hit paper, which then become law.
Yes.
And that there needs to be some level of ego shedding and on both sides, and that courageousness. And then the rising of fear that you see, that people are not communicating, they're not sharing information, all of those things in play. So you have a vision of what you'd like to see. You have a vision of what's standing in people's ways. Like, you're seeing it all, Shawn. how do you resort to, because when you're laying your head back on that pillow or face forward and you're screaming into it, how do you maintain wellness on a day-to-day basis as all of this is ruminating, circulating, and you're planning, cultivating, and designing? How do you tune into wellness on a day-to-day basis? What does that look like? Because there's people like you right now that are doing the same kind of things, and they're running and running and running. And so you're an example of how you are navigating this in the best way for yourself. Mm-hmm. How do you do that?
This is where the sports thing comes in for me. You know, being in competition, I always found that if you have a mantra, if you take a time to, you know, have a statement that you state to yourself over and over again. I have a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King on my desk right by my computer, and I set my phone underneath it every single day. And it says, if you can't do great things, do if you do little things in a great way. Mm-hmm. And I think about that every single day. And then I also take that time to escape. I take that time, like I said, to go fishing. I take that time to take my dog on a walk in the morning. This morning I walked by myself, and you just try to step away from the madness for just a little while and decide when you're going to come back into it. Don't you know, I don't force myself to come back into it. If there's a time when I'm just like, I can't do it, I've learned from watching some other peers and some friends, and they're like, well, just don't. And I'm like, can you do that? And I've learned that you can. You can just say you just don't, you know, and you just do something else. Talking to someone earlier today about being in a cubicle. Decided, no, I'm not doing it anymore. You know, that's the way we have to be to maintain our physical and our mental health. If we are not willing to take the moment for ourselves, enjoy whatever we enjoy, but do it fully. Don't carry all this work with you when you go to do it, and step away. One of the biggest things I do to get rid of all the stress is I ref Little League football. When I'm out there for 4 games every Saturday now. Starting this Saturday is when we start again. I don't think about anything other than my fellow officials and the game and watching these kids have a ball. I'm good. And, you know, after about 6-7 hours of that, I can come back and you know, figure out my game plan. And if I don't want to figure out the game plan on that day, I'll wait till the next day. And if I want to figure it out that day, I'll just say, give me another day. Now, that's not easy for everyone because a lot of people are working and a lot of people are doing things that, you know, they have a lot of responsibilities. But even then, you can take those moments. We've heard from 1 million people, take that 10, 15-minute walk, just get away. Those things are real. Those things are real. You know, that power nap, that 10-minute power nap, or even just 10 minutes of staring at the ceiling, those are real. Anything you can do to just have that moment where you can just find a little bit of peace will help you rejuvenate yourself. And I've started to really practice that. I'm not good at meditating yet. I am trying, but my brain keeps going, so I can't quite get there yet. Yeah. But that's one of the things I'm working on now. So I have to continually work on it as an individual. But finding peace for me is to find those mechanisms of escape. And when I go and do those things, I let things go, and I'm getting better and better at it. I wasn't always like that though. I always carried everything with me, and it's just practice. It's just like, you know, any other profession. You have to, if you want to get good, you have to practice at it. And I told somebody who was doing some coaching for me, and they said, well, you got to practice this stuff. And I was like, well, you're making sense now. So what am I going to do? I can't procrastinate anymore. They're like, no, you got to get to practicing. So I'm still practicing every single day how to get, you know, calm myself down, how to get to a place to where I'm feeling that peace. And I'm finding that it allows me to think more clearly and to be able to strategize more clearly. But it's hard. It's a difficult practice.
Yeah, because we're not trained to self-care.
No.
We're definitely trained to work.
Yeah.
And work hard.
Yep.
And not let things get to us. And And we're trained to not acknowledge those things. And so self-care is a newer thing that's still not quite normalized, but should be.
Yeah.
And I thank you for, one, leaning into your courage, your voice, and encouraging others to, regardless of where they stand politically, socially, to let them, you giving them space to let them lean into their courage. And I also am thankful that you are taking care of yourself. You are making it a point to, because you're setting the tone for everyone else that's doing this work. And so more leaders like you.
Thank you.
More leaders like you. And so thank you. Thank you so much for being in this conversation with me, in this space with me. And we have plenty more conversations to come.
Great. Thank you for having me. This is wonderful. It's great always to share, time with you, and I learn from you as well. So
I learn more from you,
don't think I'm not paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn.